This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of its commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. In this episode, the first of two on the topic of weddings, we explore the concepts underlying the central elements of the wedding ceremony. We also discuss ways within the confines of halacha that couples sometimes individualize their wedding ceremonies with additional components. This episode has been dedicated in memory of Ahuva bat Cherna and Michael, Luba, and Rachel Golda bat Kaila and Tzvi Aryeh, Goldie, two women connected through the marriage of their children to one another, and full disclosure, my husband's grandmothers. Though their lives' journeys were very different, Luba surviving the Holocaust and Goldie growing up through the Great Depression, they shared a great love for their families and thoroughly enjoyed a lebedik simcha, where they would dance together with much glee. They understood that every wedding celebrates not only a couple, but hope, continuity, and new beginnings. May their memories continue to bless every simcha. This is also a great opportunity to remind all of our listeners that episodes are available for sponsorship. Please be in touch and email us at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com to sponsor an episode. Hi, Shayna.
Hi, Yosefa.
Tisha B'Av and the 3 weeks are behind us, and it's the middle of the summer, which means that we're at the height of wedding season,
yes,
right? Which is an exciting moment of the year when we feel like we can celebrate again. And this episode is being released on Tu B'Av, which is a day that is associated with joy and with celebration, and specifically love and marriage. And the reason for this is that Tu B'Av is a day that the Gemara in Tani tells us that the different tribes were informed that they were allowed to marry again after a temporary restriction that had been enforced so that the tribal inheritances would remain intact. And the Mishnah describes how Tu B'Av was a festive day, and the women of marriageable age would dance in the vineyards and in their white garments, and no one could distinguish between who was poor and who was rich. Mm-hmm. And the young men would go and seek out their spouses. And so it's a day that doesn't only celebrate romantic connection, but also celebrates the fact that we're people of Israel that are going to be woven together. And we think it's a great day to talk about weddings.
Yes, excited.
And as teachers of young women, as Kala teachers, and we meet couples, both of us, that we have the privilege of attending a lot of wonderful and happy weddings. And we have had a lot of opportunity to think about the different components. I definitely can't say I thought about it before I got married necessarily. Retroactively, we had the opportunity to think about it. Both the key defining components of every ceremony, as well as the various customs that differ from couple to couple. And we see a lot of varied customs out there. And there are so many things to discuss and understand around the wedding. And so in this episode, we wanted to talk about the underlying conceptual ideas that sort of sit at the root of this major life cycle event, primarily the Kiddushin and Nisuin, which are the two main components that we need for a couple to be considered married. And then in our next episode, we're going to talk about many different aspects and elements that are part of the wedding day itself.
Before we actually talk about the wedding, I want to step back a little bit and talk about marriage, just to give, some kind of foundation here. And for me, when I think about marriage, I relate strongly to the pasuk that appears at the beginning of Parsha Breshit, which is after Hashem creates Adam, and then he says, Lo tov hayot Adam levado, that it's not good for man, or for human really, to be alone. As Selo Ezer Kenegdo, I'm going to make for him a helper mate. And what's interesting is that we would expect right then for the next pasuk to be the creation of Chava, the creation of woman. But instead, we read how Hashem creates all the animals, and then Hashem brings them to Adam to give a name to each one. And when you give a name to something, it represents a certain understanding of the essence of that thing. So when Adam goes through all of the animals and he examines each species and he gives a name to it, he's really thinking about what is this and what's my relationship to this species? And the Torah tells us, Lo matzah ezer kenegdo. He couldn't find a mate that felt suitable for him. And Rav Soloveitchik in his book Family Redeemed writes about how in Gan Eden, Adam was really feeling this sense of existential loneliness. He wasn't only looking for company. He wasn't only looking for physical companionship. He wasn't only looking for someone to help him with difficult tasks. He was looking for someone that he could connect with on a deep level, that he could ponder the big questions of life with, someone that he could reflect with and talk to and really grow together with. And he doesn't find that when he looks through the different animals. And Rav Soloveitchik continues, and he makes the point there that marriage is not only about having a partner to lighten our economic burden or enable us to bring children into the world or allow us to have satisfactory sexual lives. He says that it's not just a practical partnership, but it's something much deeper. It's a place, in his words, for our lonely existence to find completeness and legitimacy. And that's why the Torah tells us, like it's relationship where two people could cling to each other and really become like a new entity together. And I have always loved this description of the Rav and really relate to it in the sense of marriage being at its core a relationship or a person with whom to experience and go through life together, the ups and the downs, someone with whom to process that with, and someone to be with us in the loneliness that sometimes we experience as humans, which is inherent to our state as humans.
I just want to jump in for a second because I know this idea from the Ramban, who writes it in his commentary on the Torah.
He also talks about
and the one piece I just want to put in there is also the idea that, right, we have famously two versions of the creation of man. Well, in the second chapter that you're describing, we actually don't have the creation of man, we have the creation of woman because man kind of just exists. But what's significant is this idea that God wanted a person to go through the process of realizing that they needed a partner,
That's
right?
exactly what Rav Soloveitchik
Exactly.
expands on.
In like Perek Aleph, so they're there, they're created. You don't have the sense of the humanity that goes along with it. But that's something,
or that
again,
journey or that feeling of that loneliness.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start with this because on the one hand, I think it's at the core of marriage. And on the other, it's exactly that loneliness that I want to be sensitive to as we discuss this topic and we begin this episode, because I know that there are men and women who are listening who are still in the process of looking for the right partner and who feel that loneliness deeply. And there might be others who are listening who perhaps for all different kinds of reasons are not able to pursue marriage. And even though they may have the best friends and the most wonderful family, there could still sometimes be a feeling that something is missing, that only a partner could fit. And that could be a really tough emotional experience. And there may also be people listening who have lost a spouse, or people who have gotten divorced, or those who are in unhappy or unfulfilling marriages. And I just want to make room for all of those different types of pain and give space to it and say that we see you and that we know how tough that is. Our life circumstances are not something that we have total control over, and all we could do is navigate our situations as best as possible. And with all that, we still thought that this was an important topic to discuss because marriage is an essential idea in Judaism. And we also think it's important to have a grasp of the key concepts and mechanisms and to understand what's happening. Like many of us go to weddings and we want to understand like what we're seeing there and what we're experiencing there on a deeper level and also on a halachic plane.
Yeah, totally. I first of all just wanted to echo that, Shana. Like you and I, we see everything, right? Meaning, I think many of us in the world have a window into all different, versions of how this looks. And I really just want to echo that and say that we really, really, really see you. Meaning, we really do. Whether it's just on our peers or the women we teach or the women who come to us for advice, like, really just want to echo that because I think it's really important to start this episode with that. And something that I think about a lot, you started with Adam Rishon. I want to actually skip to our modern moment because what's unusual, I think, about marriage, which we're going to talk about from like the uniquely Jewish perspective, is that it's one of the elements of what's, I think, our distinct Jewish and religious lives that we do also share with the modern world. Like if we're having an episode on kashrut, right? It's not an area of my life that I share with the broader modern world. I mean, there are, of course, other religions that have limitations on, food limitations, but this is an area which I'll also just say bluntly, I listen to podcasts and read books, right, that are not uniquely Jewish on this topic because I also think that they have tremendous insight to offer me or that I'm able to pass on. And so something that I think about constantly because I am exposed to those kind of materials is I think constantly about how countercultural our Orthodox idea of marriage is today in the world. A very high percentage of children in the Western world are being brought into a family that has one parent, right? For all different reasons why there's one parent there. And they're not being brought into the setting of a marriage and two parents. And us in our lives, we still are clinging very hard onto this idea of two parents and, please God, a partnership that's going to last a lifetime. And obviously there are exceptions to that, but in its ideal, that's what we're hoping for. And I think about the fact that in the broader world, I would call it at this point the secular world, the idea of the intimacy that the world used to have in the relationship with God, right? The idea that I have a partnership with God and God is an ever-present part of my life has broadly been replaced with intimacy between spouses. And what we have in our world is that we're still holding on to both, right? Meaning we want to have that deep intimacy in a relationship with God, and we also want to have it with a partner. And I just want to say that I'm really grateful for that. Like I really, really am grateful, because I feel like we're watching, and I'm not saying that we don't have struggles, because we have all the same struggles that the world has. But I'm so grateful that we're holding on still to both sides of that rope, and that we're not letting one go, because I feel, yes, even with like reading all the, research and different modern things out there, I feel that I'm just grateful that we're still managing to keep both those pieces and want to have a relationship both like with the divine and with a partner, because I feel like it's really lacking. And I say that, I mean, you could say it's a judgmental. Yeah, I'm saying that I'm really grateful for what we have, because I think that in the broader world, there's a lot of drowning that's happening because of a real replacement of that with the other. Of course, there are other religions who are also managing to hold both, and I value that, and I value those religions that are keeping that at bay for its population as well. And the idea that I really think about when I think of marriage is I think about the word brit. I think about the idea of covenant, which this is a whole sort of podcast conversation in itself, but at the root of brit is actually the idea of emunah, of nemanut, of a loyalty. And we see that in multiple psukim throughout Tanakh, that's the idea that accompanies what the brit is. And so while we could talk about love and romanticism, ultimately a brit that we share with a partner, or that we share with God, is a commitment that we're making to be loyal, to be steadfast, to be solely devoted to that relationship. And that itself, right? And we're so lucky if it also is a love that we're able to sustain, and that we put work into an effort into sustaining a love that keeps also, I would say, the edges around that soft and supportive. But ultimately, it's a daily commitment to continue to develop that relationship. And that's what I think of when I think of both the brit that I have with a spouse and the brit that I have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a daily commitment. It's all the things we've been talking about all this time, to continue its growth and to keep deepening the connection. One other idea that I would just want to offer at this sort of opening point of this conversation is an idea that I've learned from Esther Perel, who's really a tremendous teacher of mine, although of course I've never met her, who's an internationally recognized relationship therapist. And I've been listening to her for well over a decade, and I really, really value the things she has to offer. And I wanted to share an idea that she used to speak about very often, but in a way that's suitable, I think, for our religious framework. And she says the following. I'll say also she's Jewish. She's the child of Holocaust survivors, mamash, like she's just on the cusp of the end of the Holocaust. And she's married to a Jewish man. Fascinating woman. And she says that in a long-term marriage, everybody has multiple chapters, right? And that's just a truth, right? Everyone has multiple chapters. And ideally, I'm adding this part, we want those chapters to be shared with the same partner. But sometimes they end up being shared with different ones, right? And a marriage isn't able to weather that change. But we all have those different chapters, and we all change from that point of getting married to each other. When I look at a couple, Shana, under the chuppah, or I see them sitting across from me in Hadrachat Kalot, in premarital classes, I'm always think to myself, I'm meeting them at a certain point in their continuum, like a very, very beginning point in their continuum. And my tefillah and my heart is always a tefillah that they're going to be able to weather the challenges and the different chapters that their life will bring with grace, that they'll be able also to know how to reach out for help when they don't have the resources to support all of that. But that's how it is. And anyone who's been through multiple, years or decades of a marriage also knows that to be the case. And so we're going to have multiple chapters, and we pray that it'll be, if it's a supportive, healthy marriage, that it'll be with the same person. But I also just want to, again, recognize that sometimes that's not able to happen. And if we're able to find a partner who we can go through a different chapter with, then that's also a beautiful thing. But it's an idea that I think about often when a couple will go through a crisis or go through something that's challenging. Okay, this is a new chapter of that relationship. And the question is, are we going to go through that together, or, is something else possibly going to be able to happen? But mostly it leads me to a tefillah for couples that I meet at this stage of what I do, that they'll be able to go through those chapters and be able to, that commitment will stay healthy and thriving.
Yeah. I mean, life is dynamic, and we as people are changing all the time, and our relationships change and develop, and the tefillah to be able to weather that. Also every wedding that I go to where I taught the couple beforehand, there's that extra feeling of just like tefillah that, they're at the beginning of a journey, and you hope that, they're able to navigate it as best as possible. When we go back to those psukim that I mentioned above from the very beginning of the Torah that describe the creation of Adam and Chava, we see that living in partnership with a spouse is something that is very highly encouraged. Before the Torah was given, though, marriage was not entered into in like a formal ritual ceremony the way that it is today, but rather Rambam in Hilchot Ishu writes that a man and woman, when they met, if they both wanted to marry, then the man would take the woman to his home and they would be intimate and she would become his spouse. After the Torah was given, marriage was then formalized. And what that means for us is that there's now an established halachic process, which has two components, as you mentioned, known as the Kiddushin and the Nisuin, that both need to take place in order for a couple to be considered married according to Jewish law. So the first component is Kiddushin. Kiddushin is halachic betrothal. It's the first stage of Jewish marriage. It's the stage where a strong legal bond is formed between the couple. And what's really happening is an act of sanctification or consecration in which the woman is forming an exclusive relationship with her husband and is now forbidden to other men. The couple, though, is actually still not permitted to each other until after the second stage of Jewish marriage, which is known as nisuin, meaning they're making this commitment and they're kind of sanctifying themselves to each other, but they're not yet fully permitted. During the time of the Gemara, it's really interesting that these two components of marriage actually used to happen at completely different times, often an entire year apart, meaning the Kiddushin would happen and then the bride and the groom would each return to their parents' homes. Now today at our modern day weddings, and dating back already to like the 11th, 12th century, we do the Kiddushin immediately before the Nisuin as part of one event that takes place all under the chuppah. Now, there are several reasons why this became the custom. It could be something very, very practical, that for financial reasons, when people didn't have a lot of money to...
Two parties is expensive.
Yeah, two parties is expensive, and they didn't have that kind of money. So like one party, and that way, we'll have one suda instead of two. Or it could be that just waiting the year was not simple. It was difficult, and they decided that they didn't want that anymore. Or it could also be because Kiddushin carries serious halachic weight, meaning even though we call it a betrothal, it's not the equivalent of what we think of as like getting engaged, because getting engaged today doesn't involve any legal obligation. But if a couple would want to separate after Kiddushin and not continue on to the second stage of Nisuin, then they would actually have to formally divorce with a get, which has consequences. So the Kiddushin is like a real commitment to head towards Nisuin and all the obligations that entails. And that's why we prefer today to perform the two together. In order, though, to make a clear distinction between these two parts, which each one is said over its own cup of wine, we separate them by typically reading the ketubah in the middle.
Yeah, okay, so we'll get to the ketubah. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I also just wanted to sort of go back to this word kiddushin and where this comes from, right? So it comes from the word kiddusha. We had an episode on kiddush where we spent a long time talking about this idea and the different ways that this can be understood. And the word kiddusha is often translated as a holiness. And while this is an event that has kiddusha, and that the couple is, a couple who we hope is going to be imbued with that idea, it's not really what the root of that word is likely in this context. That it really has to do with the idea of separating something out in the way that some of us might be familiar with the idea of Kedushim to you, and then Rashi brings in Chazal, which is, and you should be separate, right? And all these halachot enable you to be separate from others, so from other nations. So that is really the root of the idea here. It's separated out, and therefore it becomes something that's sacred. And while halachically, this regards the woman, right, to whom the act is performed upon, and we'll talk about that also in a moment, who now has an exclusive connection with her husband, that in our modern religious lives, I think that the idea that the couple separates themselves from other spousal options and devote themselves to one another is one that I think is most resonant, or I think that most of the way we think about it today. It's not really about the woman separating herself from others, but that the couple themselves has separated themselves or devoted themselves to one another. But it's not just for the purpose of creating a little bubble on our own. That's not the concept that we think about in the Jewish world. And that's another piece where I feel like it's very, very different from the way that weddings, and we'll talk about it, this ceremony is often reflected in the broader world. It's about, creating a home that will serve as a platform for Kedusha, that will be a home that's filled with the life of Torah and the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and part of a community also. And as we were preparing this episode, Jen, I was thinking about it, that while I spend so much time talking to couples and preparing them for weddings and educating for, intimate life, which is a tremendous part of what I know both of us do, and thinking about, Taharat Mishpacha, of course, and the Luchot Nida, that I never talk about the ceremony. Like I ask them, like, you're going to have a meeting with the Mesader Kiddushin, with the Rav who's performing the ceremony. And sort of, to me, it's also like a very, very, very short moment, right? That, is happening in a very brief moment in time. And it's just not part of the education I do for them. So first of all, I was happy to prepare this episode. And I'm also happy to be able to have something like this that I can also share with them and say, hey, you can listen to this and understand, more deeply, right. How does
it's a way of understanding what you're headed into.
Of what you're headed into.
And what's going to happen on that day.
Yeah. And I think that's also important because we'll see that this ceremony and the things that we do in many subtle, beautiful ways that, again, most of us don't even realize when we're going through it, kind of underscore the values that we want to be present in a marriage. And, the wedding is a very public act, but we also, in so many ways, want to remind our couples that they're a small individual piece in Am Yisrael, and that their wedding is a platform for something that is part of a broader nation. And we'll talk about that, where we see that in the ceremony, and also where individuals have decided to give that very strong expression in the ceremony, definitely in the past few years.
Absolutely. And before we begin to discuss the actual ceremony, which we'll do in a minute, and talk about what happens there, I just want to mention that there's a range of opinions with regard to whether or not Kiddushin and betrothing a woman is actually a formal mitzvah or not. Like, is it something that we are commanded to do? Is it something that we're obligated in? So some, like the Rambam, think that it is a mitzvah and one that's essential, especially if a couple wants to be able to engage in a sexual relationship. Others, though, think that there is no formal mitzvah at all, or there's others who think that perhaps it might be a first step in fulfilling another mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of having children, the
what
mitzvah
we call a hechsher mitzvah.
Through a reveal. Yeah, something that's setting you up for something that's going to come later. And then when we get to women and whether or not there's a formal obligation for them to get married, it's even less clear, which means that there's more halachic room for a woman to delay marriage or to choose not to marry. Regardless, though, of whether or not marriage is a formal mitzvah that men and women are obligated to pursue, we know that it certainly is a Jewish value that we cherish dearly and that we believe in. And I think it's, considered the ideal path for pursuing the creation of a family and bringing children into the world. And as I said, it's a necessary step for a couple to be able to engage in a physical or sexual relationship in a way that's halachically permissible. So even if there isn't a formal obligation, it is something, that we believe in as religious people, as something that we encourage people, if they're able to pursue.
Yeah. This discussion of whether or not Kiddushin is a mitzvah or not also has implications for how we view the bracha that we recite as part of the ceremony. And again, I just want to say, I don't think most of us think about this, right, when we're in the moment. I think it's meaningful to learn about it separately before, maybe years after we already were in the situation. But after making a Borei Pri Hagafen over wine, which we use to elevate and sanctify, which we spoke about in that episode, and why we use wine, right, in these moments of Kedusha, we say the following bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו, וציוונו על האריות, ואסר לנו את הארוסות, והתיר לנו את הנשואות לנו על ידי חופה וקידושין. ברוך אתה השם, מקדש עמו ישראל על ידי חופה וקידושין.
I'm like hearing the tune as
I know. It's hard to read it, right? So I'm just going to translate it, right? Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning forbidden marriages, and has forbidden to us those who are betrothed, but has permitted to us those who are married to us by means of chuppah and kiddushin, right? Chuppah is canopy, kiddushin is sanctification, or perhaps just the marriage. Blessed are you, Hashem, who sanctifies his people of Israel through chuppah and kiddushin. Now, already with that whole translation, you realize it's a very unusual bracha.
Right.
It's very long. Like, even just imagine, sorry, I'm going to jump in for a second in the world of like immersion. It just says al hatvila, right? On the immersion.
The Kadesh Isha,
The
or
Kadesh
whatever
Isha,
it is.
right? You have a very
Like,
easy way to sort of directly refer to the mitzvah.
the act. Yeah.
Exactly.
And here it's not that.
Exactly. So it's an unusual bracha because it says the words Asher kichanu mitzvot tzivanu, right? He who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us, but it doesn't end with the language that addresses the performance of the mitzvah. Like you said, is the Kadesh Isha, but rather it's a long, long text about what relations are prohibited and when they're permitted, and the fact that kiddushin alone is not enough to permit the couple to one another. And so it's unclear, therefore, what kind of bracha this is, right? It goes back to what you said before, that those who think kiddushin is a mitzvah, like you said, the Rambam, okay, he thinks that this is a birkat mitzvah, right? It's a bracha that you have to say prior to performing a mitzvah. And so I just want to say that what's interesting is, according to the opinion of the Rambam, who thinks that this is a mitzvah, and the mitzvah is therefore only on the chatan, who's the agent of performing this mitzvah. And so therefore he should make this bracha. But others think it's a birkat shevach, right? It's a bracha of praise. And in this case, it praises Hashem for the Jewish people's holiness as expressed through observing the laws of sexual prohibitions and also being able to allow that through kiddushin and nisuin. And in this case, anybody who's present at the kiddushin can recite it. And so here's what I just want to say, what people's real life experience is. Most of us, I think, go to weddings and we hear the Mesader Kiddushin, right, making this bracha.
And the rabbi who's officiating.
And that reflects the second opinion, that this is a birkat shevach, and therefore anybody there can make that bracha. But those who hold by the Rambam, so here we'll bring in Teimanim, right, Yemenites, or some who hold by the Rambam just specifically, that they say the chatan has to make it.
Right.
So
Yes.
that's the important difference between the way you view this bracha.
And I've actually been at a few weddings of Ashkenazim where Rav Yaakov Bidan, the Rosh Yeshiva of
He's the
Yeshivat
only
Har
one I know, by
Etzion,
the way, but I'm sure there's others.
he insists on the chatan reciting the bracha, and there's always something powerful about it. Maybe just
Very.
because it's different than what I'm used to, but
Yes.
also because it kind of, like you feel that moment where like the chatan is actually saying the bracha, and you experience it differently than when it's the rabbi who is officiating.
Totally. Mamash. And it's very striking when you hear that for the first time. Exactly. I think both of those reasons are really present. And something that comes up around this bracha also is that, unlike most brachot, which are gender neutral, is that there is a part of this bracha that's written from the male perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, right?
Yeah, we can't ignore that.
Exactly. V'asar lanu et arusot v'hitir lanu et hanisuot lanu. Blessed are you, Hashem, for prohibiting betrothed women, right, and permitted married women to us.
To
okay,
us, meaning us men.
Exactly. The us exactly is the man. And according to the view that this bracha is a birkat mitzvah for the chatan, it makes sense and helps explain why this is written from the male perspective of the chatan. There are those who do not think that this really only applies to the male or the male perspective, and that do think that it can
But
apply
even
to
though
both.
it's a male language, it's still general and still includes the kala.
Right. If this is a birkat shevach, a bracha of praise, then the language might reflect the fact that conventionally the chatan recited the bracha and then it shifted to becoming, right, the Mesader Kiddushin or some other, Rav who marries the couple and who then recites the mitzvah. And some kalot are not bothered at all by this. I would say many, I think, don't even know this. While others who have a harder time with it, and the fact that this part of the bracha is not inclusive of her perspective, even though it clearly is a very momentous moment in change of her status, right? The Kiddushin very much focuses around her, and we'll talk about that in a moment. If there is a kala who feels that the absence of a bracha that is clearly designated for her, right, this is strong and meaningful for her, then she can think about if there are other ways to address this feeling at other points during the ceremony, and we're going to discuss that very soon. And one last piece about this, that this bracha, aside from the question of gender symmetry or asymmetry, is unique because right at the beginning of the ceremony, it also highlights the sexual intimacy that will be permitted following the nisuin when the entire ceremony is complete. This is hinted to when we reference what was prohibited and what will become permitted. And the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat says this really explicitly, that everyone knows, right, what a marriage ceremony is coming to permit, but they shouldn't express it in words because that would be like low and debased, right? Shayna, something that I think about often also, whether as a college teacher or as the guest at the wedding, is there something so dignified about that, right? That it's not something that we're speaking about openly or putting an emphasis on in the wedding, but it's right there at the opening of the wedding that this is, of course, an integral part of the status change that's happening after this moment.
Yeah, and we're not embarrassed by it, and we don't think that sexuality is a negative thing, but we're kind of giving space to the intimacy and the privacy of this couple's physical relationship.
Totally.
And we're not like putting it at the center and the focus. Okay, I want to talk for a minute now about how the Kiddushin itself actually takes effect, because this is an act that sometimes causes confusion. And the reason that's so is because the Kiddushin is effectuated through a formal halachic procedure that is referred to as a kinyan. And it's done in front of two kosher edim, two halachically qualified witnesses who are not related to the couple, and they're also not related to each other. Yeah. But the part that sometimes could be confusing or could cause some angst is that we use the word kinyan. And in halacha, kinyan can refer to different things. So sometimes it does refer to an acquisition. And sometimes, especially in modern Hebrew, we know to be koneh is typically to buy something. But that is not the only definition of the word kinyan. Kinyan could also refer to a symbolic transfer between parties that results in some kind of a halachic change to a status. And in this case, that is what this kinyan of Kedushin means. We are not referring to the fact here that one party is acquiring something from the other. A man is certainly not buying or purchasing his wife. The Torah does not think that she is a piece of property or that she's a possession. That's not what's going on here. But rather, the type of kinyan that's happening here is the type where one party gives something to the other, and that in turn effectuates a change in that person's status. So typically, in our weddings today, the way that we do this is that there's a symbolic transfer where a man gives an item of some value to a woman. Most typically, we know that we use a ring because a woman could always wear it, and it's also a nice sign of marriage. And with the acceptance of the ring, the status of that woman changes, and she's now considered mikudeshet. She's now considered betrothed to the man. He says the words, Harei at mikudeshet li b'tabat zo, kedat Moshe Yisrael, that you're hereby sanctified or consecrated to me with this ring, according to the law of Moshe and Israel. And what's happening with this kinyan is that this contract, or this covenant, as you said earlier, is that a now new personal and religious status is being established, and this couple is being introduced, as you spoke about, into the framework of the laws of forbidden sexual relationships. So while they're not yet fully physically permitted to each other, because that's only going to have to happen after the nisuin, this woman on a deoraita Torah level is now mikudeshet. She's sanctified to her chatan, and she is prohibited to everyone else. And her husband is also forbidden to anyone else through the takana of Rabbeinu Gershom, who enacted a law forbidding polygamy. So this stage of Kiddushin is really representing the spiritual dimension of their bonds, meaning it's a covenant that they have now established between them, where they're saying, we are committed together to entering into this. And while it's true that it's the man who effectuates the transfer, and his wife, then is, on the other side of the status change, and that's something we learn from the pasuk that says, Ki kach ish isha, that he's the one that effectuates this. It is both the man and the woman who are now together part of this covenant. So if someone has a hard time with the concept of Kiddushin being driven by the man, I just want to point out that it's helpful to know that the halacha does not ignore the role of the woman, the bride at the ceremony, even though it's the man who is doing the action. We actually see in the Gemara that from the fact that the Mishnah that teaches us about Kiddushin does not say ha'ish koneh, it doesn't say a man effectuates the kinyan, but rather it says ha'isha niknet, that a woman undergoes kinyan, and they learn from there that a kala has to give her consent for the kiddushin, meaning a man can't just enter into a kinyan without her playing a role. She has to She can't just be passive. She has to have some kind of active acceptance. So typically we do this by the woman holding out, her pointer finger to receive the ring. And by that, she's showing that she's accepting the Kiddushin and that she's now mikudeshed. And that's something that we value a lot. Now, it's true that there are some kalot who also want to give a ring to their husbands. And I understand that because a ring could be an expression of love. It could be an expression of excitement about the marriage. It's also something that now their husbands wear that identify him as someone that's married. But that giving of a ring to a husband from his wife is not part of a halachic wedding ceremony. So after receiving a ring, a kala does not at that moment in an Orthodox wedding ever then give a ring to her husband, because that could raise questions about, are they just exchanging rings? And then that would undermine the whole kinyan that we spoke about, where the ring is in exchange for a status change and not in exchange for wear another ring. So if there is a groom that does plan on wearing a ring, a kala could give it to him in the yichud room, or she could give it to him at some point, that day or at a later point. But if it's important for her to give it under the chuppah, then that's something a couple could discuss with their Mesader Kedushin. There are some Mesader Kedushin who will permit a kala to give a ring under the chuppah, but only when it is very, very, very clear that it's not part of the Kedushin at all. Meaning, if she's going to give a ring, it will typically be at a very different part of the ceremony, and there'll be like a statement that this is only a gift, or it's not part of, any formal ritual, so that it's clear to everyone there that that's not the Kedushin.
Can I just make a little joking comment? I realize that one of the motifs of our episodes is the word effectuate.
Oh, yes.
I've never used the word effectuate, but it's so significant how much it plays a role in halacha.
Interesting.
Because the idea of status change, right? And I'm saying this like it's a very formal part, it's that formal element of status change.
That something effectuates something else.
Yeah, it's so funny, but I've been noticing as we've been saying it and we've been preparing the episodes, no, it's a really great word and it has a real expression in our halachic lives. I'm just laughing because I was thinking about that as you were saying that.
How many times did I say it now?
No, we both say it. We both say it, but I'm thinking about the significance of it on a halachic level.
Because there's halachic processes that effectuate change.
And also because we go through moments of our lives where some of us are better at making moments formal, some of us like run away from formalities, but halacha, one of the functions it has is to formalize elements in our life. Anyways, I was thinking about that as you were speaking, and also laughing about my very unsuccessful attempt to have my husband wear rings over the years. But it definitely wasn't part of our ceremony. That wasn't even something we thought about back then. So the next part of this process is the ketubah, and we'll speak about it today. We'll speak about it also in our next episode. Sometimes people are used to thinking about it as a romantic document. It can be really made really beautiful, or made with paper cuts or calligraphy.
Really expensive ones.
They're expensive. And you frame them on the wall. But in actuality, it's a very, very technical document that actually stipulates a husband's commitment to his wife, right, while they're married, and as well as financial responsibilities to her in the event of death, God forbid, or in the case of the ending of the marriage. And the goal is really to ensure a woman's financial security and to promote marital stability by laying out the obligations very clearly so that this isn't something that's debated later on. And all the details of what's in the documents can be read up. And there's many great books on it and resources out there on Jewish weddings, like Rabbi Kaplan's Made in Heaven, or Rabbi Elyashiv Knohl in the Marriage Covenant, or called Ish V'Isha, articles on the Aryeh website. And there are really very different opinions regarding whether the obligation to have a ketubah is from the Torah or it's rabbinic in nature. But there is a consensus that a married couple has to have a valid ketubah in order to live together, which symbolizes the emphasis that we place on the commitment. And after the two witnesses sign it, the chatan establishes his agreement to the terms of the ketubah through a kinyan, right? That's the second time, right? We're going to bring that up here. Yeah. So there has to be some
another
sort of
symbolic transaction.
Exactly, in which he receives and lifts up the object. It could be a pen or a handkerchief or a watch, and that the rabbi gives him to signify that he is obligating himself to the terms of the ketubah. And sometimes this is done at the chatan's tish, at that, sort of pre-chuppah celebration that happens with just the men, and sometimes it happens under the chuppah. And under the chuppah, the ketubah is then handed over to the kala, who's supposed to know where the ketubah is kept at all times. Common practice in Israel is that we always have a copy at the rabbinate so that we never have this issue of the ketubah disappearing, and in case there's some sort of moment of loss like that.
Yeah. I mean, I know of couples that got married in America where there wasn't a copy of the ketubah, and then over time, just from the ketubah hanging up in the living room and the sun shining on it through the windows, one of the signatures of one of the witnesses faded over time, and they realized it and realized that their ketubah was no longer kosher, and immediately in those kinds of situations, you have to have a new one drawn up. Even if that's the one that continues to hang on your wall, you have to have a valid ketubah at all times that a couple knows where it is and it's in existence in order for the marriage to be considered halachic. And I think that's, again, part of what you're saying earlier, the commitment, the brief, the fact that this isn't just about being there for each other and fulfilling each other's needs, but we're showing that we're taking responsibility as part of this ceremony.
I'm a person who can lose things easily, so mine is sitting on top of our prenuptial agreement in a drawer in my room. That's where it stays.
Ours
Never
is
touch
rolled
it.
Up. It's a really nice ketubah, but it's rolled up in this tube, and it's on top of our bookshelf.
I never was going to hang that up because I knew it was in that document. Okay, so what's also interesting to note is that the Tosfot notes, and the Ramah Paskins this way, our central Ashkenazi authority, that we have a minhag to read the ketubah at the wedding to separate between the kiddushin and nisuin, right? These two parts. And we've spoken until now about the kiddushin, and we're going to, of course, get to the nisuin very soon. In order to make very clear that these are two separate parts of the ceremony, since they used to be held in two different moments, and now they're done together. And different practices have developed around the way this is done. Some sign it under the chuppah, which is often perceived as a better halachic choice, but some do so before. And while it's really rare, I've personally never seen it. There are those who choose not to read the ketubah, but just have a Dvar Torah that separates the two instead. The weddings I go to, I see both, meaning there's also a Dvar Torah at some point, usually in the beginning, and then they read the ketubah in between.
In very sensitive situations, I remember my father was once Masada or Kedushin, where the women really did not feel comfortable with the ketubah being read. And in that case, they didn't read it under the chuppah because
it's a strong minhag. It's not a halachic
It's a
requirement.
very strong minhag, and it's very rare to go to a wedding, an Orthodox wedding, where they don't read the ketubah, but it's also important to understand that it's not a halachic obligation. Now, there's also a question of who can read the ketubah, and that question is actually not really addressed extensively in early halachic literature, probably because
women weren't interested in reading it.
Yes, and also the ketubah probably wasn't always read out loud because when the two parts were separate, so then this is a function of the fact that we do them together. In recent years, though, there's been a lot of discussion about a woman reading the ketubah, at least in certain circles. And this is coming from a place where there are kalod who really want to find opportunities to honor from the most pure place of they want to honor female Torah scholars, mentors of theirs, teachers, at their wedding, and to include women who are special to them as part of the ceremony. At the same time, though, because this was not something that was done, it definitely is a change to common practice, and that's why it's understandable that there's a range of views with regard to whether it's permitted. So on the one hand, there's Rav Yehuda Henkin Zatzal, who he thought that in communities where it's accepted for women to give shiurim and to lecture and to speak before men, and it's not considered immodest, then it's also fully permissible for women to read the ketubah. And Rav Henkin felt that the reason that's permitted is because we've said already that the reading the ketubah is merely the reading of a contract of obligation in order to make a break between the kedushin and the suin, and therefore it's not a davar shebekdusha, it's not a bracha, and there is no halachic issue for a woman to read that. Other rabbis, including Rav Hershel Schachter, a well-known senior Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, Rav Yaakov Aryeh, the Nasi Yeshiva of the Hesh Yeshiva in Ramat Gan, and a leading rabbi in the Dati Leumi community here in Israel, they also acknowledge that there is no formal prohibition against women reading the ketubah. They're very honest about that. But they have come out strongly against it because of modesty concerns. They don't think that it's proper or the accepted practice for women to speak before a crowd under the chuppah. Now, in the circles that you and I travel in, it's not unusual to have women speaking or participating in some way at some point under the chuppah, but it is still pretty rare for me to be at a wedding where a woman reads the ketubah. I've been at a couple, but it's not the most common. And the Rosh Beit Midrash of our Beit Midrash of Migdal Luz, Rabbanit Esti Rosenberg, she makes a distinction for herself between reading the ketubah, which is of now something she's not comfortable doing, and other forms of female participation at a wedding, such as giving a speech under the chuppah or giving, different kinds of words of encouragement or participating in other ways. And the reason that she makes this distinction is because the reading the ketubah is a well-entrenched custom and became at some point part of the ritual. So it has those overtones in a way that, giving a Dvar Torah doesn't. And there really is a spectrum of things that you see. And just one other thing that I felt like is so important to bring up about the ketubah, and I didn't feel like we could just ignore it and pass by it, even though it is a loaded and sensitive topic, is that something that always jumps out to me. Yeah, it always catches me when I'm at a wedding, is that every time they say the name of the kala, it's followed by the word betulta, which means that the kala is being referred to as a virgin. Now, again, the ketubah is in Aramaic. I think most people, are not paying attention or don't even understand it. But if you have a sense of what's being read there, it kind of is wait, why do they have to keep saying that? Now, there's a lot of interesting material, in the sources that you said before, about why virginity is something that has to be mentioned at all. I don't feel like this is the time to get into that while people are cooking and exercising and folding their laundry and driving or whatever, to get into this kind of loaded, sensitive topic. But what I did want to mention is that in a situation where a woman is not a betula, she's not a virgin for whatever reason, and it's not something that's like out in the open. It's not a couple that's been living together for years, or a woman who was previously married and everybody knows that, but it's something very private and very personal.
Yeah, about her personal history.
She doesn't want anybody to know that, including the Mesader Kedushin. Like her chatan knows, but she doesn't want people in the audience to be paying attention to that. So there are poskim like Rav Moshe Feinstein who hold that the standard ketubah can be written and can be read as usual with the word betulta, because as long as the chatan has accepted the terms of what has been written, that is all that matters. And to me, it's important to share this because I would never want a woman who has whatever, kind of experiences in her past, and she is coming to her wedding now. I would never want her to feel dread or fear or some kind of angst that something that's very personal to her is now going to be kind of public property. And I'm happy that our poskim are sensitive to that.
Totally. It's such an important point, Shana. And also, anybody who does know a little Hebrew Aramaic, I think that it does catch them that moment. And after the ketubah, we have the final stage, right, of the formation of the marriage, which is the nisuin, which is also the word we referred to the ongoing state or the status of marriage that's afterward. And here's where we have multiple understandings of what's happening in this nisuin that I think are also significant to sort of go deeper into. Rav Soloveitchik holds that nisuin is a very powerful time when the betrother and the betrothed intertwine their lives into one existence. But there are multiple ideas about what actually constitutes, right, the legal act of marriage. And we see actually a lot of these opinions being expressed in the way that our ceremony has developed since then. Some think that the nisuin is an act of a couple standing together under the chuppah while the wedding blessings are being recited. Like that's the nisuin
the very
itself.
act of standing there.
Exactly, the standing there. Another opinion is that some think that the act of nisuin is the couple like inaugurating their intimate relationship, which is typically symbolized by the yichud room, right, where they're alone together in seclusion. This may reflect the pasuk in Breshit of v'davak b'ishto v'yulav echad, right, that they become one flesh, and they create something together. I will just put in here that in reality, couples are not having a sexual relationship in the yichud room, but in theory, that's what can happen in that space.
Because they're allowed to be alone together for the first time, according to halacha.
According to Rav Soloveitchik, the joint space that they're joining together is actually under the chuppah, right? That they're standing under one roof there. Meaning it's not necessarily the yichud room, but it's actually the chuppah itself that they're standing in that space with one another and together.
And what I want to point out about Rav Soloveitchik is that he's emphasizing that it's the two of them kind of intertwining their lives together symbolized by standing under the chuppah. It's not the man taking a woman into the chuppah, which is another opinion.
Right. And again, notice here we're differentiating between the kiddushin and the nisuin.
Right.
The nisuin, there is something that in many ways we see expressed is the togetherness of the couple, dafka, right? The kiddushin has these elements that do feel one-sided to a certain degree.
Right,
and we've discussed the complexity of that. Okay,
permitted,
but nisuin is different. Others think that the marital act, meaning of nisuin, is forming a joint household, right? Where the kal physically even enters the home, right? And that might be reminiscent of the word of kikach ishisha, which you mentioned before, which again, that likicha in the Torah was the marriage itself. So that's sort of like taking a wife and her coming into the home. There's even another opinion which thinks that the nisuin is actually the groom covering the bride's face with a veil because of this obligation to provide her with clothing, which is one of the three things that a man is obligated.
We refer to as the badekin,
Exactly. And in our weddings, and in our weddings today, we try and incorporate all these opinions in different ways throughout the whole sort of evening. But it's also important to know that there are some communities, like Sephardi communities, where the chatan does not cover the kala with a veil, meaning there is no badekin, or the couple doesn't actually go into the yichud room after the ceremony. But I will just say that for even those who hold by the opinion that there's no yichud room, which one name we'll throw out is a Rav Yosef, that many weddings still, though, do have a private space that won't halachically be yichud room, meaning it'll be open or they'll have a kid there. It's not locked, etc. The different ways to sort of get around that so that the couple will still have a moment to just be by themselves because it is very striking.
Nice
exactly. Like the public element of it, but really the private nature of what's happened. So that also is something that some couples do. And once the couple is married, then there's really a system of complementary rights and responsibilities where each member of the couple actualizes their personal and practical commitments to one another. And as a very significant part of the nisuin, we recite the Sheva Brachot, which I know are my favorite also because of the singing. singing and the excitement that happens there, which is the series of 7 brachot that are made over the marriage. Many authorities view them as Birkot HaShevach, as we already mentioned, brachot of praise, as we mentioned, as a possibility of what the Birkat Kiddushin might be, and that emphasizes the glory of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the glory of his creations. And traditionally, men are the ones who are called up to say these brachot under the chuppah, and this might be because these brachot are considered an obligation of the Chatan. It might also be just because they're an obligation of the minyan, and therefore must be recited by someone who counts toward it, or could be because some think that women saying these brachot raises questions of kavod tzibur, an idea that we mentioned in previous episodes about minyan or tzniut issues, which is a separate concern, or just maintaining what is considered accepted traditional practice in this area. And we will place in the show notes, Shana, 2 articles that explore this more deeply, because there's more to say about this.
Yeah. And then also in the next episode, we'll talk more about the Sheva Brachot and what we say in them, because this episode is focused really on the conceptual ideas, but we'll get into like the details of all this in part 2.
Yeah, but I will also just say at this moment that sometimes the fact that this marriage ceremony doesn't have like a built-in place for women to have an active role can be difficult for men and women getting married today. Yeah. And that's a truth.
Yeah, and just to give a little bit more space to that, I think in the segment of the Dati Leumi community that we are part of, and we're aware that this is not true across the Dati Leumi community at large, and it's definitely not true, around the world in America or whatever, but in the community that we're part of, I do see a lot of intentional effort put into thinking about how to involve women in the wedding ceremony. Yeah. And I think for people who are not familiar with this, and I hear this from my friends in America sometimes when they're at a wedding here, it's like it's very jarring, and it could feel like almost not orthodox, like what's going on. They're not used to seeing women speaking up under the chuppah. But I just want to explain that the drive here is not coming from like a feminist place or an anti-halachic place of egalitarianism. We need to hear a woman's voice. That is not at all how I experience it. I see it as a bride, as a kala, really looking for a meaningful way to bring those close to her, especially like Torah personalities who have taught her and who have influenced her life, or relatives that she feels like have influenced her growth, to bring them into this significant moment the same way that, men have the opportunity to take their rebbeim and their teachers and their relatives and their uncles and to honor them, like it's not like, oh, men do that and we want to do it too. It's like that is very, very meaningful and significant, and that enhances our experience. And therefore, I really believe that as long as it is considered acceptable in a community for a woman to stand up before men and to give, shiurim the way that you and I do, then there's room also under a chuppah to allow for that. And therefore, whether it's in the form of sharing words of Torah at a chuppah or serving as a master of ceremonies, or I've seen weddings where sometimes for the Sheva Brachot, they'll call up a man and woman together, which you could kind of roll your eyes about, but I think there's something beautiful. They'll say, okay, mechubad with the next bracha is Uncle Chaim and Aunt Bracha, and that's a way of also honoring, their aunt. And it could be that the couple walks up together and only the man says the bracha, but the fact that she's under the chuppah with them is meaningful enough. Or sometimes the couple will come up together and the man will cite the traditional bracha, and then the women will either recite a translation or a personal bracha to the chatan and kala, or maybe some kind of piyut. Now, some halachic authorities are concerned about this because they think that the Sheva Brachot should be said, like kind of one after another, and this is some kind of interruption between the brachot. But others think that as long as the chatan and kala themselves don't speak between the brachot, which is actually really important, like from the first bracha, which is Borei Pri Agafen, they need to be able to take sips at the end of all the brachot, and they have to kind of not speak that whole time so that that bracha is relevant to them. And I've actually been at a few weddings recently, because a lot of times they're whispering the whole time, and I've been at a few weddings where, the Mesader Kedushin will say, we know you love each other, and we're so happy that you have good communication, and you should continue to talk the rest of your life. But right now, for the next few minutes, there's no talking, because they have to remind them about that. But many posts can think that, especially, we see in Israel, there's like singing between the brachot, and they think that it's okay, as long as the chatan and the kala themselves are not speaking. It may, though, be considered preferable that if a woman is going to speak, that she do so either before or after all the Sheva Brachot are said, as opposed to in the middle. And we go to weddings where there's often a beautiful tefillah that is based on a tefillah that was originally written by Rav Amron Gaon, which sometimes is colloquially referred to here as the eighth bracha, the bracha hashminit, even though it is not at all part of the, Sheva Brachot package, and they'll have a woman say that under the chuppah, and that will typically be recited again either before all the Sheva Brachot or after all the Sheva Brachot, and it's a prayer for the joy of the wedding to extend beyond this couple to the entire Jewish people, and for happiness and blessing, for the couple and for the family that they hope to build, and for Am Yisrael. And it's another opportunity, if someone is looking for one, to have a woman be part of this meaningful occasion.
I just wanted to bring in a personal piece, which is that I feel like Zevi and I got married like right before the cusp of when I started seeing all these shifts happening in like to tweak the ceremony. And it's so interesting because literally like 8 months after we got married, we went to like a slew of like 5 weddings, and everyone did some sort of like variation. And I wasn't in that mindset then. Like it wasn't something that was significant to me.
And we come from America where none of this is typically done.
And it was just funny though. It's like now I don't know. I guess in the small world I live in, I really go to any wedding that isn't like this, that isn't some sort of shifting or personalization. I guess I wanted to explore a little bit the idea about like the practicality of the changes that couples have made to the wedding ceremony. But I feel like in order to do that, we need to just devote a little bit of time to talking about the cultural piece here, which is very, very big. And Israeli weddings are much more free and flexible. And this is, I think, a deep reflection of the culture here. In general, in Israeli culture, it's something that I mostly value. It's much less formal. And in many ways, the way that the ceremony functions in Israel is actually very in line with the way Jewish weddings were traditionally performed, which is that everybody kind of stands around. There's not like a formal sitting. They stand around the chuppah, and there's really this sense of like, we're all in this together. It used to be that the community would pay for the wedding. Like there were many, many different practices that,
they're like escorting you into this as
mamash,
a community.
and it's like a community that's escorting them, and you very much feel that in the way that like physically the crowds gather and the way that they dance each other to the chuppah.
It's different.
It's very, very different. Jewish weddings in the States are, and I imagine also in Europe, are much more solemn, right? There's formal sitting, and there's also a lot less change that goes into the ceremonies in Orthodox circles, right?
Much more formal.
Much more formal. The singing tends to be more performative, like who you're hiring as the band and the special singer for the chuppah, like those are more common there. And I wonder how much this solemnity is a reflection of like Christian culture that surrounds it, and the way that often is done, and the sitting in the rows, etc. And I will just say that I really, really, really love weddings in Israel and the spirit and creativity in them. But I also think there's a power to the solemnity. And sometimes we can go a little bit too far in that direction, and people, show up in their jeans to a wedding or whatever it is you could see around here.
Yeah, and that affects the atmosphere.
It does. It affects the atmosphere. But I also love like the dancing and the freeness and the singing. And it's like really beautiful. And I'm always like been so grateful that I hadn't even been in the country that many years, but that was our wedding. Meaning we had a very Israeli wedding, which was a very big shock to my family. And one other piece I'll also add, and I think that it connects to the informality of Israel and where it actually works in our benefit, is where it's been, that informality has been able to morph into flexibility. Because between Corona and the war and wars and Iran and, every time there's another like attack, or I always think about, oh my God, who's getting married tonight? Or my daughter's bat mitzvahs, that all of them were like, in strife. Are they going to happen in the past, few weeks, all the events she was supposed to go to? But between both of these like crazy world events, I just will say that like couples have gotten so used to the idea that like they'll plan something, but who knows if it'll really happen. And they're so great at it. Like we've taught so many, right? In the beginning with Corona, I don't know if you remember like the anxiety we had about like, are they going to get married? And when they're going to do, different preparatory things and halachic elements. And like we really developed strategies that like utterly served us.
And the whole world had to deal with that. But I think what you're saying is that when by nature the whole ceremony is less formal, so then it's a little bit easier to flow with changes.
Or like recently a kala said to me, oh, there's all these WhatsApp groups. Immediately they send you numbers of halls that are able to get a wedding together within a day. And like they have all these resources available for like, and what I want to say though is that there's also like a lot of stride that is taken in, not only because I think that there's a resilience like within the Israeli culture, but it's also like, it's okay. Do you know what I'm saying? We didn't spend a year and a half planning our wedding. They've been planning it for the past, few months. I'm talking about the small religious circles we function in. Engagements are very short. They get weddings together very quickly. And it's not the same like intensity or drama in that way. So the ability to like change at the drop of a hat is, to me, like somewhat of a product of that kind of culture. They also cost
a fraction of the cost.
They do. They're still expensive in relation to our lives. But yes, it's obviously something that's a bit different.
Yeah, and I totally relate to both sides of what you just said. Meaning, when we first moved here and I started going to weddings, I was shocked. Like, I was shocked by the whole atmosphere that people were standing, even when there's a few rows of seating. Like, a lot of people are standing when there is seating.
Guests.
And also the seating is typically not separated. Like, it's not men on one side and women on the other, which was very, very different. The band is very active during the ceremony. There's a lot of singing in between, like in between the different sections, in between the different brachot. Every time they call someone up, there's like another song. And I kind of missed in my early years here that sacred feeling that you were describing, like the solemnity or like the silence. Like my wedding, for example, was very large. My father was Rabbi of a shul, and the entire shul was invited, and it was silent. Like you could hear a pin drop. There was such respect given to the ritual. And then I came here and it's like, this is Kedushin. Like, this is something really serious going on. And it's kind of like this, relaxed attitude about it. But over time, I also really grew to appreciate all the things that you're talking about. The spirit, the energy, the fact that the crowd doesn't feel like spectators. They're not there to like watch a performance, as you said. They are total participants. Like, they are part of like what is creating the whole intensity of the feeling and the spirit. They're all in and they're really playing a role. But I agree with you that sometimes it gets out of control, or sometimes I'm at a wedding where the friends don't know their place and like they just keep singing and like they don't know when to stop. So it works beautifully when it's the right balance and when it enhances and it doesn't detract or take away like attention from the couple and attention from the ceremony. But when it's done right, it's so beautiful. So beautiful.
Yeah. As part of being in this role of the Chatan and Kala, which is obviously something that's very individual for the couple that's there, they're really also demonstrating their commitment to joining like the broader Jewish community, right, as this new entity, as they're connected to each other. And sometimes a Chatan and Kala really want to find a way to make the ceremony itself meaningful for them. And while they're acknowledging the fact that they're becoming part of something bigger, and there are ways to express it as well, they also want to feel that they have made this meaningful for them, reflecting, things that they want to be part of this ceremony in a way that goes beyond the formal definition of how it's supposed to run. Now, for some, that might be incorporating the women in their lives into the ceremony or having some sort of voice of those who have taught them.
Meaning
or those
they want to
love.
Personalize it in a way that feels specific and meaningful.
Exactly.
For them.
But there are other dimensions and other ways that couples sometimes do this in the ceremony. So just as an example of some changes is that sometimes a kala will make a siyum, right? At her, she'll have a kala's tish, sort of that is parallel to the men's tish, which he may or may not make a siyum. But it's a way, again, to make this sort of classic stop along the way, something that's personalized, that they've invested in themselves. Sometimes it reflects itself in people who speak under the chuppah. I've even seen a Chatan or a Kala speak under the chuppah, which to me is always so brave, mamash, because you like have to rely on your emotional state at that moment. I find that so brave when I see that. Sometimes the couple will say the shechiyanu on the talit together. We'll talk more about that in the next episode because there's also
he's saying it on the talit
and
she's saying it, on her dress or on her ring or something else. But
so there's a way to halachically manage that. But yes, so that's maybe also saying the shechiyanu on the talit, or just both being put under the talit, which is also a minhag, a custom that is not seen the same in all sides of the world. But I also just want to mention that there's another sort of recent wave of change, and that has been dafka part of this idea of remembering how we're subsumed as part of Am Yisrael, right? It's dafka exactly what we're looking to do in this ceremony, to raise it beyond the individual couple and remember that they're part of something bigger. And they've found multiple ways to express their gratitude, perhaps to the IDF, or to remember friends who have fallen, right? Or express their unwavering devotion to the state of Israel. And some of the ways I've seen this done is like really breathtaking and is just like you can barely breathe, honestly, throughout the ceremony. And just as some examples, like some of them I've seen couples getting married under the canopy of an Israeli flag as part of, with the talit, etc. I mean, not obliterating the traditional piece, but adding on to it. Sometimes they use a talit of a fallen friend that I've also seen done, or they recite the tefillah for Medinat Yisrael, for the state of Israel and IDF under the chuppah. Sometimes I've seen this done by relatives who were serving, right? There's all different ways to like personalize that piece as well. And I guess the one that the most kind of just like turned me into a puddle in that moment is chatanim, who actually read out the names of their friends who are not at their wedding, who they wish would have been there, and spoken about them. And like behind all of these changes is we really see a generation of people, of young people that are looking to use a traditional frame and make it their own. And in the broader world, you know, in the broader secular world, couples write their own oaths and they're individualizing it. But I don't think that it's really the same thing. Meaning there's the individual expression, and that really focuses on the love between us. And here I'm also talking specifically, yes, individualizing it and making it meaningful, but also remembering the fact that we're part of a community, which is, as we said earlier on, is to not just be in that bubble. It's to remember that we are a small piece in something that's much bigger. And the texts are the same and the ideas are the same, but the spirit that's imbued in them is modernized and really individualized. And I find it really, really, really meaningful. And I also will just say on a personal level that like being present at these weddings in the past 3 years, like they have been something that have actually really lifted my spirits. Like at other times where I might complain a little bit about having to drive to the weddings, there's a lot of weddings in a week, or et cetera, and it takes you out of your home life, and those are things that are sometimes a challenge. But like I would find myself going to them and just remembering like what are our values. And honestly, for me, like chupot were therapeutic for me. Like that's where I would allow myself to cry when like I was totally in functional mode, and like just because even the decision to get married, even though 6 days later they're going back to the army, and like all these crazy decisions that people are still making right now, right? To like this devotion to this thing, and getting married young also, right? And just
getting married when you know that they have 2 years left in the army.
And it's really complicated, and we're not at all sugarcoating that. It's very complex, and we're also there to see those moments and the work that we do. But there's something it just sort of kind of like, for me, it strengthens my faith, like in the Jewish community, very much so. Yeah. And I also just want to mention that this idea of like connecting to Am Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael, I think also is already there, like in the traditional frame of these brachot, right? In the Sheva brachot, in brachot 5 and 7, right, where we invite Sion to be blessed and rejoice with her children, and it's and definitely singing Im Eshkachech, which we'll talk about more next time, of sort of remembering ourselves as part of something bigger. That's already right there in the DNA of the brachot, and so I think that it's really an extension of what we already know to be there.
That even though you are like at the height of like this personal joy and this personal momentous transition and very powerful stage of life, that we could tap into the klal and kind of make this about something much bigger than just the two of you. I totally agree that weddings lately have been even more meaningful and more moving and more emotional than they always are. Like all weddings are moving and emotional, but at these weddings, like there's literally not a dry eye in the room. And it's not only because of the pain. It's obviously painful when they say that the cup that they're doing the kedushin over is like a cup of a friend of the chatan, that has fallen, or as you said, the talit that is hanging over them, or whatever it is. These lives have been cut short because these are people who were so committed to protecting and defending Am Yisrael that they were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. But the tears that you're talking about are also tears of strength, and they're tears of hope. This is a generation, this is a door of men and women who are on the front lines in terms of leading us in their belief and in their determination to keep on moving forward and to live meaningful lives. And all the weddings we see also of widows from the war who have decided that they're going to move forward and they're going to continue with all the pain. It goes back to what we spoke about in the episode on Sfirat HaOmer about like holding the pain and the joy all together, and like both are real and both are being experience, and all the emotion is just like heightened, and it's made weddings extra special these days. So I think every time that I go and I see another way in which people like have thought intentionally about how to incorporate these elements, it really makes an impression, and it really leaves you like thinking about it. And as you said, there's also a therapeutic element because it helps us as an kind of process together what we've been through and really rejoice that there's another couple that is, kind of taking their commitment to Am Yisrael upon themselves and moving forward with that.
By the way, one piece that I actually don't think I ever told you, my husband and I got married under a chuppah that was made from the wedding dress of Nava Applebaum, and who was killed with her father on the day she was supposed to get married.
They took half her dress and made it into a chuppah, and half is the paruchet at Kever Rachel.
Exactly. And it's funny because it was just, we were told that that's what we were going to do. Like it was like from Zevi's parents, they're close friends. Yeah. And I didn't, and we mentioned it. I'm actually remembering this now as we're speaking.
He was killed the night before her wedding.
Yeah. I just am thinking about it now that like we had also done that, but it wasn't even my initiative. Like my in-laws sort of, I guess.
It was a different time, but I think in this country, there's always been an element of this.
Yeah, totally. Shayna, what's your takeaway from all of this really full episode, which as we said is the first part of 2, and we're going to have more time to sort of go into all the pieces of the wedding day itself.
Yeah. There's so many thoughts running through my head right now, but I think really what I'm left thinking about is how much I appreciate the way that Judaism provides us with such meaningful rituals around our major life transitions. Like we kind of take it for granted because we're so used to that, but it's really, really, really special. And I love the fact that if you go to an Orthodox wedding, no matter where you are in the world and no matter what segment of the community you belong to, the major elements of the wedding are going to be the same. Yeah. There's some really
it's that common language we talk about.
And it's the power of ritual. Like it both binds us together horizontally to other Jews wherever they may be, and it also connects us vertically to the generations that came before us, to our past, to our ancestors, and also to the future, to the generations that are going to follow us. And therefore I find a lot of meaning in the wedding ceremony and in all the different formal traditional parts of it. And I also like, and this is something really great about halakha, that within the framework of halakha there are ways that we could bring ourselves and we could express ourselves and we can make the ceremony more personal. And I think it's a great example of the unique nature of Judaism, that how we could have an event which at the same time could be like deeply personal and also deeply religious. It could be communal and even national, even though it's like your personal event. And I'm looking forward to talking more about some of these elements the next time when we talk about all the different parts of the wedding day and the procession or the walking around the groom or the candles, like all the different minhagim, and also where we'll talk about the minhagim that tie into the klal, like the breaking of the glass and the singing of Imishkachich and remembering, and that even at these moments we're part of the national story. What about you?
I guess I just want to add and encourage that I really encourage people to feel comfortable personalizing, and that they, these are events that we, on one hand, they're very short, but we'll remember them for the rest of our lives. And I've seen people who sort of look back and say, "Ugh, I wish I would have done that," or
been more intentional,
or that didn't really reflect us, or that reflected very much our parents, but it was a way that didn't settle with us. Or
it's a hard balance.
It's a hard balance because that's also a big part of the wedding that we are very gently overlooking. But I think that I just want to encourage people, if they're listening to this and this is something ahead of them, whether practically or theoretically, I want to encourage us to think about that, like what that might look like if we want to. For some people, they want to leave it exactly as it has been for generations, and that's what's meaningful for them, and that's beautiful.
That's where the power is.
Exactly. But I also want to encourage for those who really would love to do something like this, that there are so many ways to be creative in a way that is still deeply traditional and reflective of our values. Mm-hmm. And I also just want to say that a wedding is kind of like the first practice, because after this, please God, we have many other life cycle events, some of them which have a more formalized ritual to them, and many which don't. And even within those formalized rituals, there's a lot of room for that child to be expressed if it's in, a bar bat mitzvah situation or births or things like that. And I will just say personally, I know how meaningful it's been for us, and we're still, on this journey, please God, of figuring out ways to bring other levels and additional layers. And I just want to encourage those who want to do that there are many meaningful ways to do this in a way that's also really aligned with
some of which
with
we didn't
tradition.
touch, by the way, because in America there's often programs and people sometimes write very personal things there, or they write a letter to their guests, or sometimes there's special tefillot that are given out. There's really a lot of options.
Yes, so many options. So I just want to just sort of like put an asterisk by that, and remember that there's so many ways to go through this in a way that's meaningful. Our next episode, as you said, will take another dive into the wedding, and it's going to be a practical guide to the wedding day and all of its customs. So looking forward, Shana.
Me too.
Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance. You can contact us with thoughts and questions, or if you'd like to sponsor an episode at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.